All right, hello.
Hello.
Howdy, howdy.
Hello.
Howdy, howdy.
Wednesday night, 9 o'clock.
Week number 3, orchestration.
Mm-hmm.
Three is the magic number, so if we've made it so far.
Yeah, we're doing well, guys. We're
We
doing
built
very
a
well.
habit.
I
Let's
like how
pat ourselves on
we're
the back.
already patting ourselves on the back. We've only just
Yeah.
barely started the third week. I'm like, we're doing well. We're good. We're good.
Just healthy
We've arrived.
self-esteems. It's fine.
It is
How-
important, actually.
I mean, we've planned way beyond week 3. We've got to, do all
Like
the
week
ones that we've done.
5.
Yeah.
All the way to week 5.
So we thought of starting by going over what it actually means to be an orchestrator, right? And like what, and perhaps some misconceptions of what that might mean as well, particularly in film music, but in other things as well.
Yeah, I mean, we can always talk about orchestration as it relates to film music and recording sessions, and also just about the concept in general, and we can delineate what we mean.
I think if somebody is watching and wants to sort of orient the conversation in a specific direction, and I mean, there's so much that you can
lead us
talk
astray.
about. Yeah, exactly. There's so much that you can talk about when it gets to orchestration. Then.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess-
as suggested, why don't we start with just some definitions of kind of what we, what we see orchestration is. And I think there's also maybe some misconceptions about that, even just in the title of what that is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess one way of looking at it is like, what did you think it was before you started having to do it? I thought of it like, I suppose in, I don't know, school to college, you picture orchestration as being turning something that isn't orchestral into something that is, right? I guess that's the simplest way of looking at it. And I suppose traditionally, examples of that, Mussorgsky pictures it in exhibition, that kind of thing. Someone who could do themes but couldn't orchestrate, and then you give it to Ravel, and who can very much so, and things like that. So that's kind of what I had in my mind before I started having to deal with other things.
Yeah, I think based on like an undergrad education, that was my treatment of it. You know, you would study like Mother Goose as piano, and then you would study it as an orchestra, and you would look at them side by side and try and understand what transformation has gone on there. And that was my first introduction to it, even understanding what it meant.
And I think in many ways that's still the best way to learn it. I mean, in my view, I think, or certainly,
I think that's the craft, like that is the craft of orchestration, and then kind of how it's applied in a job is maybe, has evolved.
Well, I think that's something kind of I mean, not nominally, but in my head, I distinguish between the two. As much as I credit myself as orchestrator on projects, I'm well aware that on half of them I haven't really orchestrated, or there's a huge kind of gradient of how much orchestrational input the orchestrator has actually had. And it varies a lot how much the composer would admit, or vice versa, how much the composer's actually done all of it and it's really, glorified MIDI transcription. And I think it's just to remind ourselves, we should also talk about it from a compositional point of view. And that it is very much, if you are writing orchestrally, that it is, I think it's almost by definition integral to the process of writing, to be able to understand that.
I think it's important to understand as well, though, that orchestration doesn't necessarily refer to just an orchestra. It refers to just your selection of instruments when it comes to writing. That can be anything from a chamber ensemble to full symphony orchestra and chorus.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's just...
If you think about it like very generally like that, then I suppose it's hard to separate it from composition at all. Like when you think of an idea, you are making decisions with that idea based on what instrument plays it, or what you do with it, what register it's in, what kind of dynamic it's in. All of these considerations are kind of orchestration considerations as well.
Well, I guess in that respect, what you're doing then is separating the sort of the compositional part from the orchestrational part. And I think the orchestrational part in that sense deals with like tessitura, I suppose, if that's the right word, or the timbre of the instrument and how that is affecting what you're writing for. Whereas the compositional side is perhaps more structural or harmonic, or however you want to look at it. It's sort of apart from and all to do with one and the other. You know what I mean? It's a Venn diagram where the circles are like that. For me.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of felt that it even goes a little broader as well, that like sometimes when I think about mixing, I almost think of that as like having very similar principles to orchestration, which is basically like just don't put too many things in the same frequency, like don't muddy the frequencies, be clear, have separation. That's kind of like, that's mixing, but that's also kind of orchestration at the same time. And I guess that means that's a result of the fact that they both come from the same principles of sound. How do we hear sound informs both mixing and orchestration.
Well, perhaps then that's something we can talk about first, is the, what does the more traditional, for lack of a better word, definition of the word orchestration mean? Like, what skills do you need to have? What understanding does that require? And and how much does that happen?
Put some flagpoles in the ground just on that, because some people viewing might also not have any idea what orchestration is, or have never sort of trained in it formally. So it's really just this idea of you're taking, in a way, you're sort of separating the composition as kind of like, here's a theme, or here's just a melody. Here's a melody and some chords, and now we're going to decide which instruments we want that played on. So that's like when I think Shane mentioned initially of kind of, when Sam was talking about Mussorgsky and then going to Ravel, we're referring to specific, kind of pieces in classical music history where it was initially written just for solo piano, and then it was orchestrated to be played by a full orchestra. And it's the same music, but then it's just choosing different colors and different instruments to play it back.
And it's important to note that there are some composers, very good ones, that weren't good orchestrators. I guess the previously mentioned Mussorgsky is a classic example. He wrote very good, bones to a piece of music. But he needed someone else to make it orchestral. And, I mean, I know which one is my favorite, but without those bare bones, you don't have a piece of music, and it's amazingly well written without.
And I mean,
side of things.
Even if you restrict it to not just thinking about one composer writes a piece and another composer takes it and puts it into orchestra, if you even just think about a single composer could have two different orchestrations of the same material in the same piece. I mean, that's quite common, actually. And that can give you a really huge insight into, if you listen to those two and ask yourself, wow, what is the difference there? How does it make me feel? How does it come across? What's the effect of doing that? That's just a really good starting point into just comparing.
Are there any pieces that any of us have heard that perhaps you heard the orchestrated version first and then found out there was a piano version, or
Rite of Spring.
So Rite of Spring.
Rite of Spring for two pianos.
Really?
Yeah, that's an amazing piece.
Wow.
I've heard a four-hand version. I've not heard a two-piano version.
Two pianos, yeah. It sounds amazing. I found out last year on YouTube. There's a great video. It's amazing, not as the orchestral version, but it's a different version, and it's really, really great.
They are great. There's a really good The Melodica Men as well. Have you seen that?
Oh yeah, that one.
They do some amazing arrangements.
So if I could just, sorry, I don't want to cut each other off, but just another kind of flagpole definition that I think would be helpful, which isn't, I would say this is more of a personal definition, but the difference between orchestrating and arranging. I think that
you could say, and this isn't true all the time, but in most cases, orchestration is not changing the composition, where arranging is. So if you were to arrange something, you kind of have the freedom to change the chords, reharmonize it, maybe add melodies, add counterlines, that sort of thing. So it's a little bit between them. It's kind of, composing additional material and changing it, or even changing the structure. Whereas orchestration is really taking the same piece and then putting it on different instruments.
I kind of think of it as a creative ownership thing. In much in the same way as like a mixing engineer, it's why are you there? You're there to improve a piece of music as an orchestrator. As an arranger, you're there to create a new one based on the material of someone else or yourself.
So basically, orchestration, you're dealing with textures, whereas arranging, you're dealing primarily with structure.
Both, I think both with arranging, it can be both. I mean, there's often complete reorchestration or orchestration as well, but there's the like you say, the structural element as well, and the musical.
I guess I just meant that if you're actually adjusting the structure by default, you're going to have to rearrange the textures.
Yeah. Because it would be like if you take a piece and now you're going to put it like a traditional melody, but you make a bossa nova version of it. That's an arrangement. That's not orchestration. You're fundamentally changing it.
Although, guys, you're enlightening me, like, because I've always used the word orchestration and arranging interchangeably, but now that you're saying this, I realized that actually there is a difference, and it's true. Like,
I think it's a personal definition. I wouldn't, say, but I mean that's kind of the way that I distinguish them.
Yeah,
I was just gonna say, yeah. I mean, I agree in one sense, but at the same time, it's also like it's difficult to separate them entirely. I think there are definitely some blurry lines and some gray areas, especially when you think about something where if you've orchestrated it in such a way that you're now like you're automatically going to have an influence on the balance of the ideas. Something that was in the foreground before might be slightly more in the background now, and that does affect hugely how the piece comes across. To say it's 100%. A different piece of music, no, but it's interesting how the moment you start changing things, you can say, well, that's different now.
I think 100%. There's totally blurred lines between it. Which I sort of mentioned at the beginning. It's not in all cases, but I think just for kind of a clarity to put down a flagpole definition of say like, okay, if that's what that is most of the time, then it at least gets us into, I guess what was trying to establish with it is like, what then are we actually talking about just specific to orchestration? Because we're not talking about, making a new version of like, like a different genre or something like that of a piece. But yeah,
which is particularly relevant to composers who are dealing with, long form narrative, because they have to be able to arrange.
But essentially, when you're writing cues, you're arranging themes into exactly. The structure of what's needed.
You need variations on a theme, and to do that, you need to be able to arrange.
I was thinking that it's interesting that if you just think of like, I don't know, I think a textbook that we all ended up at some point using or crossing paths with is The Study of Orchestration by Samuel Adler. Yeah, exactly. And if you so like if you wonder what's orchestration and you buy a book which is called The Study of Orchestration and you look at it, what it is like a big ass book that teaches you how to sort of write for all the sections of the orchestra. But it's really interesting because when I used it and bought it and read it for the first time, I was coming from like a few years of jazz composition and jazz arranging, which is I think much more I think practical, empirical. Like there are certain rules basically, and you just kind of that actually tell you, oh, you need to use this sort of voicing for this thing and this for that. And when you approach orchestration in a more orchestral sense, so like classical orchestration, I think it's so much broader and more open, and you can do everything and its opposite, and it will just give you a different effect, a different color. To me, it was very sort of vague and confusing at the beginning. Like having this book that teaches you a lot of things, but it made me feel like it's not really teaching me anything. It's just like showing me examples, and it takes time to figure out that that's what it is about in a more sort of classical term, learning the sound of things, learning like that something sounds in a certain way if you play on this instrument, on that register of that instrument, and blah blah blah. And it's such a huge thing that you need to learn and incorporate that. Can be a bit overwhelming.
I think it's worth saying there that that's absolutely true. It's sort of daunting that these are all the possibilities. Some things are wrong, but these are just different, and you've got this wide scope of how to orchestrate. In a book like Adler, I think then you add a session into that, and suddenly you've got a whole different set of limitations, and you are bound by time and money, and so you have to orchestrate in a differently intelligent way. You have to do it in a reliable way that is going to sound good.
I guess the point of good orchestration at the end of the day is just having clarity of the musical idea, isn't it? It's like the Adler, it gives you lots and lots of different tools and examples, but ultimately you need to figure out how to most easily get your musical idea across, not have it be obscured by sort of anything else that's going on.
Yes, but I think it's not only the music. Oh, sorry, Sam. I was just gonna say, and it's not just the musical idea, I think, but also the target of your music, which is what Sam, I think, was trying to say. Like, what is it for? Is it just like, am I writing an orchestral piece that it's going to be performed by an amateur orchestra somewhere, or a professional orchestra somewhere else? Or am I writing a piece that it's going to be recorded and I need it to sound,
Yes, but in either of those contexts, you'd have to think about clarity of musical ideas. You'd have to think about clarity when it comes to an amateur group as opposed to a studio session.
I think just to clarify what I was saying, I think I was coming at it from more of a third-party orchestrator point of view. As that is my experience really of this flag of film music orchestration is generally because of time constraints that is done by someone else if there's the budget for it. And that there are different priorities when you are orchestrating someone else's music for a recording session. You will have tons of ideas, perhaps born from your study of Adler's orchestration, but you won't be able to use them because it will take too many takes to get right, or it won't. Someone who has final say will hear it and say that's not like the demo, even though it's actually better. Little things like that. You have to be there are certain standard rules of doing things, but that doesn't mean you can't that there isn't a craft to it. I mean, you have to know what you're doing.
Guys, I feel like just in fear of getting a little too sort of nebulous, because I know this all makes sense completely to us because we work together, but to maybe talk a little bit about what we're talking about in kind of orchestration for film, specifically, and recording sessions and things like that. Why don't we take a step back and kind of look at that? So
can I offer a way of looking at it? Yeah. So for me personally, what was my first experience of orchestration? Probably playing clarinet. I started to learn what a clarinet could do. I knew what sounded good on a clarinet, how the registers sound different. It's got like the Chalumeau low register and the Clarion high register, and they are completely different, and they can be used for completely different purposes, and they sound different on different players. I'm sure me and Ale sound very different.
I hope that we sound different. I hope for you sound different from me.
but anyway, my point is that you learn what an instrument can do. Now that's one instrument. So I think for me, orchestration is having as close to a mastery of understanding of every instrument in an orchestra. Now I realize it's not limited to an orchestra. For me, it is to a point, but that's how I kind of see it, is understanding what every element of what you're writing for can do, what its limitations are, what its strengths are, and how they work in combination, which is also vital. And
well, I think that's probably the more important aspect, isn't it? It's not just knowing what colors you have to work with. It's not enough just to know that you can see red and it's red, it's blue and it's blue. It's knowing how those colors interact and how they juxtapose, and also how they combine.
Yeah, and you can't just trust a notation software to tell you all the right things. Because they're not,
or any of the right things.
Any of the right things. Well, yeah, and so I think depending on the piece you're writing, you can. I mean, it almost sounds like I'm being really, really stingy about the orchestra. I love the orchestra, and I think its possibilities are virtually endless. It's why I do what I do. In all honesty, more than I don't know. Yeah. More than many other things, but using an orchestra is what excites me about orchestral music. And but I think it's that having that devotion to understanding each instrument and knowing its limitations and its strengths, and I think that's
and yet what that is true, but to try to tie in with what I think Mike was saying, that is kind of like what is broadly, I think, meant as orchestration. And then if you get into the film music industry and get hired to be an orchestrator, what you end up doing is rather different, isn't it?
Well, it can be almost anything.
It can be almost anything, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess if on my end, it was like, I kind of learned because I came into composition via film music. Like I sort of learned composition because I wanted to be a film composer. And so it was almost sort of backwards in a way, not learning kind of from classical music first. So I, attended loads of these kind of film music workshops and things like that when I was pretty young. And then, I kind of was hearing about like what orchestration was from usually sort of semi-crusty old orchestrators who were kind of, fed up with an era bygone. And they would tell stories of like, oh, well, sometimes you're given, a melody and set, told to write the whole cue and things like that. And it was kind of, I think that side of it was this more slightly romanticized, maybe, version, or it was more about the craft of like what they dealt with was a lot more like, here's a sketch of, some melodies and the chords and that sort of thing. This is the general mood that I want you to achieve. So the orchestrator's job and craft was, okay, if I want this to sound dark, or sad, then I'm choosing the colors of the orchestra to achieve that. And that was kind of that role versus, just making it sound nice or making it capable. It's sort of the creativity is almost like the composer has sketched out the drawing and now you're painting it in. And so it's up to you to decide like what the overall aesthetic is going to sound like. And then, kind of, so studying orchestration that way initially, and then doing a lot of orchestration, and kind of getting into it. And I think a lot of modern film music orchestration is you don't have the freedom to change the color or aesthetic because it's already been agreed upon and it's already been approved by the director. So it's really that you aren't allowed to kind of add new instruments to a line, or adjust that. But what you do have to do is make it sound as good as it can with the players that you have in the session. So for instance, if a piece was written with massive string ensemble patches, and now you have 20 strings in the studio, you need to make it sound as good as it can. And that's where that same craft of orchestration and understanding the instruments and what they're capable of comes in, because now you need to figure out, well, if I only have 4 cellos, if I voice the chord this way, that line is going to come out much more, as a sort of melody
versus getting buried within the texture. And so I think that's kind of what a lot of like the modern orchestrator's job is. And again, blurs that line, sometimes can be asked to do more or less than that job.
There is a degree of creativity, though. I think, as in, obviously,
I think it's completely creative.
Yeah.
I don't want to, make it sound like it's not.
Yeah, the thing is, like, it may be. I'm trying to think also of the orchestration work that we've done together. I remember that I was talking about that with somebody, and they went like, oh, so you're basically doing MIDI transcription, which is kind of like yes but no, yes but no.
Well, the thing is, it's not inaccurate, but it's also not to be looked down upon because it's significantly more complicated than it appears.
Yeah, exactly. But also because, as I was saying, I think there is a degree of creativity. Like when you get a cue that is fully composed and approved by somebody else, and your job is to try to figure out how to make sense of these enormous amount of MIDI tracks, which are all just called strings. And
well, I mean,
I think it's not just okay, it's strings, but like, how do I voice this? Who's gonna play this little MIDI note, and how am I gonna interlock these things? And depending on the choices that you make, it can actually give a rather different effect and sound. So I think I feel like it's very important to actually, sorry, let me rephrase this. Even though it may look like it's just MIDI transcription or it's just something really mechanical, like you get a project full of MIDI things and you just need to move them from your DAW to a notation software, which if you describe it like this, it sounds very mechanical and boring and just like, oh, a monkey could do that. But it takes actually a lot of awareness of traditional orchestration and like classical orchestration, because you need to be aware of like, oh, if I just move these, if I just decide that this is going to be played by this line, or this, it's going to be played by a viola instead of a violin, it's going to make all the difference in the world. And therefore, and as you were saying, Mike, if you know that you have a certain amount of players and you need to make a cue sound good for those players, and it hasn't necessarily been written with those players in mind, there's a lot of like juggling around and figuring out how to make it sound good.
I think if I may, I think that there's so I mean I've been an assistant orchestrator for 7 years, and which is essentially a luxury of an orchestrator when they don't have time and they do have money to get someone to do the MIDI transcription. It isn't orchestration, but it is a skilled job. You need to understand notation. You need to understand when something is wrong. You are, as an orchestrator, assistant orchestrator, second to last, but orchestrator is the last line of defense, unless we're talking about copyists, who are also very important for this. But you are the last line of defense to prevent wasted time and embarrassment in the recording session if there's mistakes. It is your job as an orchestrator to catch any mistakes, which, sorry composers, they happen a lot when there's no time. And if it's a lot of notes, you're going to make harmonic mistakes or whatever. And so if you're an assistant orchestrator or doing the MIDI transcription part of the job, that is your job. Is if you find any mistakes, you have to flag it and get it clarified immediately. Now, MIDI transcription is a skilled job. In a company I work for, we separate the two tasks. We do the sketching part, as we call it, which is MIDI transcription, and that can take up to 75% of the actual workload time, because it's
just to define that. You mean that this is purely the transcription of MIDI from the DAW that's delivered by the composer into notation software.
Or audio transcription as well.
Yeah. So you're not at this stage revoicing or anything. So it's I guess what I'm, only clarifying just in case nobody knows kind of what we're talking
Yeah.
about. It's all
Well,
very in terms.
Fair, yeah. I think the to sort of skim over slightly, we're dealing with MIDI, which is the digital language of music, and it's crap, and it has been crap for 30 years, more than. And it's not been improved. And as a MIDI transcriber, you have to deal with the translation of that language between softwares. There are various notation softwares which you use to create your beautiful looking score that no one would ever know you went through all the trouble, but it does not interpret what comes out of a DAW very well. They're getting very good. Dorico is absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, exactly. Dorico is gonna get us all out of a job soon.
Well, this is the point we're getting to.
Well,
it's very good.
It's very good. But the point is that there's a lot of, yes, the task can be mundane to tidy up the MIDI so it looks like purposely written notation, but that requires an understanding of, firstly, how music should look, but also interpreting what the composer meant. The composer, all they care about and all they should care about at that stage is getting it approved and getting the best music to the director. So they only care about the audio. They should care about how it's orchestrated and the layers of sound they're putting together in an intelligent way. But fundamentally, they're sending an audio file to a director to be approved. And so they don't care if things line up to a musical grid in the DAW. They care that it sounds natural and musical and nice. And so when that copies over into Sibelius or Dorico or Finale, it doesn't look good at all. So you have to do the preparation by tidying it all up, quantizing it, and then getting it into your notation software. And then there's even more work to do to get it looking at. So there's a lot of hours that go, often hours, sometimes days, that go into just the MIDI tidying. And then you get the creative side. Now, just to sort of reiterate what I said before, when we're talking about orchestration, that for me is it, asking why would you have an orchestrator is like asking why would you have a mixing engineer. You're hiring someone to make your final product sound better. Composers could orchestrate the things themselves, they often do, but you're getting a fresh set of eyes, another set of opinions and background and specialty and just another musician, in the same way you're getting other players, to just improve your music. And with that comes not, a lot of composers say orchestrator but MIDI transcriber, really. A lot of composers say that. And that's because, I'm sorry, but they're not fully appreciating the level of expertise that's gone into that final session score. Like, orchestrator has gone through that MIDI with a tooth comb and decided what is acceptable, what is musical. Vincenzo, you said that we've received sessions that are like string patches. Fine. We've also received ones which are like evolution patches that are just held down notes that you have to transcribe by ear and come up with that's one end of the spectrum. And yes, there's a lot of orchestrational decisions there, but you also get stuff that is orchestrated and voiced out for specific instruments. And they'll be out of range, but the sample doesn't care. So you have to spot things like that. And that's the sort of base level of orchestration. You have to know what's actually possible. But there's when it becomes nuanced is knowing what sounds good and making intelligent suggestions. Yes, a melody might be on high cellos, but blend it with some violas and it's better, almost invariably. Little things like that, where an orchestrator can make your music sound better. And so that's why it's a collaborative and important part of the process. Again, kind of talking about third-party orchestration there, as opposed to orchestrating your own stuff. But that's why there's an importance in that process, I think. Is that fair to say?
Do you guys want to, as the sort of title suggests, talk about some different approaches? And I think also because we've been really focusing a lot on orchestral writing in sort of full orchestral writing. I think mostly because, like, if you start there, it gives you a lot of foundation and kind of rules and principles that can then be applied to even when you're using only electronic instruments. And you're applying these same principles of kind of balance and color and texture when you're using just synths. So I don't know, I think it'd be interesting to kind of talk about a couple different things. Like we've done this for film and, you know, sort of for 120 piece bands, for 30 piece bands, and also our individual projects, you know, where things are maybe a bit more limited, or it was written kind of with that in mind, you know, with that specific group or players in mind.
Well, I guess I've got a sort of question for Ale, maybe in that sense, talking about kind of using like synthesizers as a orchestrational approach, because I guess what you have with that is you're not changing instruments, but it's more malleable. So you're adapting your instrument to be more suited to purpose. Is that perhaps closer to what is?
The principle is, I don't remember who said it, maybe Shane. It's basically when you're mixing, you try not to muddy certain frequencies, and you try to have the right spacing between. So if you're using synths with strings, you don't want a synth with a certain frequency to be basically disturbed by some strings in the same frequency. You wanna have, it's basically what how our former teacher used to tell us. You need a bass line, a middle line, and a high line. So you don't need more than that. So stop going all over the place with stuff, because you're muddying everything, and you make it less clear. So basically, it's the same principle to have your music as clear as possible. I mean, if you're looking for clarity, of course, to have your music as clear as possible, and to have it's basically the same approach as orchestration. I mean, I'm pretty new in the synth world, but that's how I approach it, basically.
Yeah, but it's interesting you mentioned that, because like when I don't mean to stray back to orchestral scores, but when you said that bass, middle, top, immediately for me a John Williams score comes to mind, because there's a clarity of orchestration, so it's clearly a transferable thing. I guess it's understanding the purpose of the music, and yeah, it all like overlaps with mixing, doesn't it? Just understanding what needs to be heard, what is in the way of that, and how do you solve the problem, you know?
And sometimes you find new problems when you're, for example, arranging strings for a rock band or a pop band, and you're trying to do interesting things with the cellos and the double bass, but I mean, it's gonna clash with your electric bass. So if you want to have double basses in your orchestration for a pop band, I mean, either the bass player is not playing, or the double bass player has to follow exactly what the bass player is doing. I mean, at least in my experience, or it's gonna be a mess, especially in the low frequencies, because that's where things get even more difficult. I mean, you can have some clashing in the high frequencies, and just as you can have, you can play a cluster of notes on the high notes of the high keys of the piano, and it's gonna sound pretty clear which notes you're playing. But if you have the same cluster like 4 octaves down, it's not gonna be the same thing. So
it's amazing how many of the things we've been talking about just come back to like the fundamental principles of sound, because what you just said there just made me think, it's the harmonic series. Of course it is. Like, you know, you can't have notes close together in the low register, and you can have them up higher up, and it's because of the harmonic series. And when we were talking about not muddying up too many of the same places in terms of frequency, that's orchestration, that's mixing, that's like sound design, which synth colors you choose and how you EQ them. Like it's just amazing how unified it is. I don't know.
And all, you know, infinitely more important when you're servicing a film or dialogue, I suppose, to be more general, because suddenly you've got to be more aware of other frequencies and sound effects as well. You know, you've got to know what you're competing with or what you're, avoiding. But like one thing that kind of makes me think now is that perhaps for me a different way of thinking about orchestration is that I realize many productions aren't lucky enough to have budgets to record as much as they'd like, but whatever the instrument, whatever the thing that's happening, usually it's probably fair to say that orchestration, you are preparing music for someone else to play. I think that is usually, or that's how I see it, is that whether you're writing with your orchestration hat on or you're orchestrating someone else's music, you are having to come up with something that is the best interpretable form of that music for this player.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, if I can just cut you off, Sam, because I think that's where the whole it's just MIDI transcription thing can be so reductive, because I can't think of how many times I've come up with like 4 different ways of writing the same idea that look completely different on the page, and then I'm trying to decide, yes, but what is most easy to understand? It's like writing a speech. When you guys were talking earlier about MIDI transcription, I was thinking, what we get in MIDI is like machine code. It's like computer code that only a computer can understand. And we have to turn it into notation, which is a musical language that people have spent years training to understand. And that comes with a lot of baggage as well. Like, depending what instrument you play, certain things will just be more easily understood than others. And even in terms of like reading different numbers of sharps or flats, like different orchestral groups like different solutions for that. And so it's really about communication. You want to be able to put something in front of someone and they don't ask you a question because you told them everything they need to know and nothing more. If you tell them too much, then you're wasting their time. And like we said before, in an orchestral recording session, time is really important.
Well, there's 2 sides to it. There's the practical side, which is you want to make sure time isn't wasted, but there's also the musical side. You want to get the best possible performance. So that, I think, that can tie back into what V was saying about like big band stuff. You don't want to overcomplicate a big band chart. You want there to be freedom for the musicianship to come out. And if you're overselling it or over detailing it, certainly with big band musicians, they don't want that. They want to play. They want to be the unit that they're used to being, and then obviously with solos, you just give them chords or whatever. But I think even with the arrangement and sometimes less is more, and understanding that is important as well.
Yeah, that's definitely a hard one. I've had situations where I've gone into immense detail, notating like dynamic swells and diminuendos and whatever. And then I've had other ones, espressivo, MF, go for it. And I'm like, that's amazing. Because what you're doing there is you're relying on their musicianship, their interpretation of what they're hearing, and their understanding of, okay, I've done a melody like this before for this composer, whatever. I know what they like. You're sort of relying on that musicianship sometimes. But even knowing to do that is part of the skill.
I think there's a meticulous nature to orchestration that encourages this, which I've been told numerous times by various of my employers, to trust no one. And the problem with that is it means you can become over detailed in your orchestration. And actually, we're all musicians, we're all instinctive, and guess what? Certainly in London, the players are better than you. So they can see their part and they understand the phrasing without even thinking. So you don't need to give them that. They will play it better without it. Usually, sometimes it's odd phrasing or whatever, and then that's when you need to be making intelligent decisions. But yeah, sometimes that less is more is a really important thing.
Yeah, but then by the same token, sometimes being very specific and making sure you have certain markers there so that we can all be talking about the same thing. So like, let's say you do put a 4-bar phrase for a string line or something. Then the composer might say, that sounds good, let's try it with a 2-bar phrase, you know, and then everyone's very clear. They know where they're talking about. They know how to make modifications because you've given everyone the same tools, the right tools to communicate about what they want to have happen in the recording session. So it's like, yeah, that's what's so tricky about it, is because you want to balance what you said about not telling them, you know, stuff that they already know and wasting their time. But at the same time, you also want to put things in the score and in the parts that can start a dialogue and can quickly say, yep, you do that, you do that, you do that. And again, be really efficient with the time.
And I think there's a study to that, and there's a personal element to that as well. You know, if you are frequenting the studios of London, you're going to see the same players, and especially if you know, I've worked on a TV show for a while that very often has the same players for every episode or many of the episodes of the session. So you can ask them what they like. You know, have the same bassist, Mary Scully, for everyone, and so you're writing for a specific person, so you can really do, you know, what they prefer. And I think that can kind of extend into like if you're orchestrating for your own ensemble or of people that you play with, that you know, you can really write for them as well.
I was gonna say that some of the most amazing, I mean, this is more for jazz music, but like some of the most amazing jazz music, big band music that I can think of is Duke Ellington's music, which was written with, I think you can really feel there's sort of a more, it's jazz music, it's arranged for a big band often, but it has a very strong classical orchestral approach for some to some extent. And what I think that I was gonna say, he wrote his music and he orchestrated his music knowing exactly who was gonna play each line. Like, he wasn't writing a baritone sax line, he was writing a line for that baritone saxophone. And it's something that makes a huge difference, knowing like who's gonna play that. It gives you, you know, to go back to what we were saying before, it gives you a completely different approach. You know that, you know, every player has certain skills and you can rely on them for more things more than the others. There are people who is more used to be a solo player, players who are more used to be playing in sections, and they all have different skills, and it's just very interesting.
Orchestrate like on the fly, like, you know, just essentially show up with that bare bone structure we were referring to earlier of like, okay, here's the tune and the chords, and then kind of be like from, you know, like while they were playing, sort of shifting and changing the orchestration and kind of being like, all right, you take that line, you take that line. Ooh, we have a new buddy to the chat.
we have a new friend. Eddie, what's your orchestration approach? Eddie, tell us.
Don't do it.
It's
I'm not gonna do
dogmatic.
a voice. I'm just very nice.
This is
Just
the guy.
saying, Eddie's joined us to try and boost our ratings a little bit.
I think just answering one of the comments on Twitch is talking kind of about like having a lot of instrumentalists, like either kind of the approach of sort of over detailing versus under detailing, and whenever there's some sort of confusion, it'd prefer the latter, to have it a little bit less. And I think especially like I'm a string player, historically was. And, you know, like I used to think, well, I know, you know, I can write my own bowings. I know what I want, but it was totally useless. Like, it's not, because I'm still not the section leader of that group. And I think there's also a bit of that trust of like, you hired the band because you want them to bring something to it. You know, like you didn't just get them because you wanted, you know, like a live sound that's better than samples. You want it as a collaboration. And so kind of trust in them that, okay, you know, this is my idea. What can you do with it too? You know, just like you would if it was a small ensemble. You know, if you were recording a string quartet or something like that, I'd imagine, you know, especially if you were writing for the group, you know, that you knew, then you would want to kind of have that feedback with them.
There's just no better feeling, I think, for
Yeah.
me. That's why I compose is that responsive, the players playing your notes.
Just answering a quick one too. I see James just mentioned kind of, is the orchestrator composer usually in the session to clarify? Absolutely. I mean, and you sometimes, depending on what's going on, the composer might have other fires to be putting out, or dealing with playback meetings and kind of stuff with the producers for the project. The orchestrator is then running the session. And it's definitely something that I mean, in most sessions I've seen, I'm sure the same for you guys, that I mean, either being the orchestrator or working on something, the orchestrator is there, kind of calling the shots a lot of the time, because they know it so well. It's kind of, they're the ones who've interpreted it to be there. So, and as the orchestrator, I think you would kind of hope to be there and to be involved, especially if it's a collaborative process. And if
it's not always the case that they're there, but they certainly should be, because like you said, Mike, the two people that know the score best are the composer and the orchestrator. It's certainly in its session form.
Yeah.
And it's really important for them to be there. In fact, my boss, the guy who I've assisted, he's a conductor. So he's often been the conductor after orchestrating. So then I, as his number two, I've been left to not run the session, but to be,
the booth.
From the booth, indeed, to be
the guy to blame if something.
The guy to make very quick changes, as I'm sure some of us have experience of,
and then running upstairs to the copyist and printing them off and putting them in the break.
Just to say something about James' question there, I've had a few sessions where the composer hasn't been present, and that's kind of a different feeling. Like, you just try and you're like, you follow the demo, you make sure you have your bases covered. Sometimes you're like, okay, let's grab like an alternative version, where we're playing it louder, even though that's like too strong for the demo or whatever. I just have a feeling from experience that they're going to want to have that option. And so this comes back to a totally different topic of like, how to run a session and make sure that you get everything you need, and time management and everything like that. But sometimes you have to make difficult decisions, like it's not worth recording that again, or it absolutely is, or I want to record that again, but I need to make changes, or I want to record that again, but if I make changes, it could be the wrong way. So I'd actually rather just leave it. Like there's lots of little decisions like that to make, and it's tough to be just the orchestrator and not the composer there, because there are often things you don't know and you have to guess, or you have to just try and make good decisions in the abstract.
In that way, sometimes your job is really to deliver as many options as possible, and kind of I was on a project earlier in the year and was running the sessions myself, and it was like, we knew that the director was indecisive and was changing day to day. So it was pretty much like I think that's the time when I was in the sessions where it was most like just kind of digging resources. It was kind of like, get as many ways, as many ideas as we can, because something could be useful. And so we would try things like luckily we actually had kind of a luxury of time. There wasn't a ton of music to record. So we could say, okay, we're going to cover it as is. Then now we get a version. It was mostly just strings. So it's like, now let's do a version kind of half the ensemble, and then another with just the section soloists and things like that. So we could say like, then the music editor had the option to show the director and say, how about, this chamber version that we did, this one's something super light. So, I wasn't instructed to do that, but I knew kind of through experience that it's like, okay, the more we can get, the better this will be.
How about this 8-bit version that we did?
Yes. Let's get an 8-bit version
and win everything. Guys, can I suggest a question which I think would be interesting, because so far we've been orienting this discussion, putting ourselves in the shoes of the orchestrator, because we've all more or less had experience working as orchestrators, assistant orchestrators, and stuff like that. But what I think could be interesting to briefly discuss is, did we all have our own music as composers being orchestrated by somebody else? And how did it feel from the point of view of the composers? And for those of us who haven't had that experience, like, do we absolutely prefer to orchestrate our own music, or like, I think it would be interesting to sort of try to switch the point of view for a little while.
I've only had it once. I mean, I've never had the money to get an orchestrator, in all honesty, but once for a musical, the musical that shall never be named musical. I got a friend of ours, Paul, from college, to help me with orchestration. And in fact, it was a kind of collaborative thing, because I did half of it and he did the other half. But it's a really peculiar experience, I find, because I mean, it was great because Paul's a great orchestrator, but you just see different things, like different interpretations. This it should be clarified. This was a traditional style orchestration, so I'd done a piano score first, and then it was expanded, and we knew the instrumentation, we agreed beforehand, and I just sort of let him do what he wanted, and then we talked about it afterwards. I said, no, I don't like that, put that on bass trombone or whatever. But usually it was great. But it is a strange thing. You have, I don't know, maybe even when you do something piano-y, I was thinking orchestrationally. So when you hear surprises, it really is surprising, maybe. But I can imagine it being both unsettling and a massive relief, knowing how much work goes into it. If you are under pressure with a project, and as long as you've got someone you trust, it's just time. I mean, and time and craft, and
so
being able to hand that over.
So you feel it changes the way you work as like knowing that you have somebody who's going to orchestrate your music. Do you feel like it changes the way you work on your music? Do you feel it changes the way you compose and you think of what you're think about what you're doing?
The assistant orchestrator in me would want to quantize things more, but the composer in me wants it to sound better. So I say, sod you, the assistant orchestrator, you can quantize it. I don't know. I mean, I won't really know until I've got the budget to pay an orchestrator. I like orchestrating my own stuff, in all honesty.
This is another question. Like, is it just a matter of you never had the budget, or would you actually, even if you had the budget, would you like to still orchestrate your own stuff?
No. Well, I mean, I feel like I'm answering these guys, but feel free if you disagree. But yeah. I see it as a collaborative thing. Like, it's like, it's like I would always want a mixing engineer if I can afford it, because they just bring something better. Yeah. They lift it. And I think an orchestrator can do the same. And I think I would be a total arse if I thought that my orchestrational word was the final one. I think that someone else can always bring something else and something better. And you always, you should always have final say as composer anyway. So if there really is something you don't like, then it's your job to correct it. But yeah, it lifts it.
I think, maybe a good segue from that is, I didn't have money to hire an orchestrator, or did I want one for my album, but I definitely collaborated. And I had Sam as kind of like my second set of eyes, come on. And we did a whole day together, like
third and fourth eyes.
Yeah. And I said second set. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah,
like, to me, I, wasn't going, especially with a project sort of so big, personal, and expensive, was not going to show up until everything was like really finally combed through. And so, Sam and I did a day together just looking at, like,
I was obviously orchestrating while I was writing, and that was a big part of doing that project. But then bringing you in brought so much more, to it to sort of refine what those ideas were. And then from working together, I sort of made a bunch of changes, and then I went to Jean-Stéphane. And then Jean gave me, kind of like a second line of feedback. And then before the sessions, I had Jeff Admajian, who conducted it, to look through. And it, also happens to be sort of like Jean was your teacher and Jeff was his mentor.
And Jeff's as high as it goes, mate. You've run out of orchestrators.
And so it was, but it was sort of like building up at every stage, there was another layer and level of feedback that could refine it even further. So while I consider myself an orchestrator, definitely by credits and experience, and I, especially on a personal project and know exactly what I want out of it, it's still, why would I limit myself from getting that kind of feedback and collaboration to, just get someone else to be able to look at it. And obviously from, that one, I was very lucky that all three of you were, willing and wanted to look at it and wanted to kind of get involved. But even with that considered, if you imagine probably the way that, John Powell writes is, orchestral, and he writes for orchestra incredibly. So it's probably very well thought out and constructed from the beginning, but it's still not to, say that then that is done. I don't know how he works with his orchestrator, but I would imagine too that there's an understanding and that the orchestrator isn't just transcribing MIDI.
What I would say though, Mike, just on my side of that is it was a great experience, and whenever anyone puts a score in front of me, I can't not look at it. But we had that day where we were listening to the demos and going through the score, but I kind of felt I more had my conductor's hat on a little bit, because it's like, I don't know, it's like the difference between composition and improvisation. This was like orchestration, and then how do we get this thing that's done better? So it was a slightly different thing. Do you know what I mean? It was like on the fly, what is standing out as can be improved. And so it was, I don't know, I guess for me, I was imagining, the players playing it in front of me based on what I was seeing. And, it was a slightly different experience from, say, just listening to it and saying, how would you orchestrate it? It was, you'd done the orchestration, but it was, it was just, I guess it was like, how can we make it better? And that, as any collaboration is, I suppose, any level of collaboration, it should be just how do you improve what you've done.
It's interesting because from what both of you are saying, like the way we were talking about orchestration and orchestrators before, it sounded like, oh, it's just one of those part of the job that it's there, and but you're kind of presenting it with more interesting spin, I think. Like, I can do them myself. I can orchestrate myself, and I maybe even like to do that. But still, I would want to get somebody else at least collaborating and reviewing what I did, because it's just an extra creative mind and an extra set of eyes, and it just improves the quality.
Wouldn't conduct. It's like, get a conductor because they're another musician. Same reason I wouldn't play bass. For God's sakes, nobody wants that.
Michael, since you just went through a mastodontic orchestral
sorry, what was that?
Not a word.
Not a word.
Could you define that for us, please?
I think
Ale got it though.
Yeah, gargantuan, let's say.
As in a mastodon?
It's like a dinosaur.
Yeah. But in a adjective form. Okay, mastodonic.
Interesting. Well, you never cease to learn.
Thank you for teaching us this word.
Thank you for teaching me that. All jokes
he was referring to himself.
I just love that there's at least 2 Italians in here, so we can double check and each other's.
You can say
Two-
words
two and
like
a half. Yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
You can say words like mastodontic and it still be affectionate.
Anyway, going back to serious stuff, Michael, you just went through something like a really big work that included writing for orchestra and recording orchestra. And so, like, what's your take on this? Did you orchestrate everything by yourself? Did you ask somebody else to review that? Like, what's the deal with that?
I think that my tendency to over control didn't allow me to sort of let anybody else look over it, unfortunately. But the thing is, the way I also wrote it was probably a lot different than the way you guys would have written it, as we talked about in last week's video. I mean, I wrote exclusively into Sibelius, and sort of unlike Sam with his show, like, I'm not a pianist at all. Never took lessons, don't know how to play, barely can play chopsticks, and so it wouldn't have been beneficial for me to write it as a piano score. So I just wrote it out fully orchestrated, and a lot of thought went into that. It was composed while I was orchestrating, effectively, like Mike said, same as his album. And for me, I had very, very specific reasons why I did that, and I sort of labored over it for ages and ages. So, I mean, like Sam and Mike, you guys looked over it on the day, but that was a little past the point when changes could have been made. But I did. Yeah, no, sorry. I should have given it to you before.
It was. I mean, that was great. I mean, we had very little to say, if memory serves, on the day.
It was so fully, like, I mean, you had labored over it. Like, there wasn't, we weren't serving a function to, like, provide fresh ideas or insights. It was really like, let's get this thing recorded in the best way it could be.
Yeah.
I think what we had was, as what you have in any session, you have changes based on what you're hearing in the room, and that's just the nuances of the day sometimes, or the specific players. And you'd be like, okay, that's how those people are interpreting mezzo piano, maybe it needs to be piano. Just these were the changes that were being made, but the orchestration was completely fully realized. And
this project is out on Friday, by the way.
That's a sneaky little plug.
Yeah, my question was not exactly random. I was trying.
Well, Michael, yours had already been through a workshop, right? Like a couple of years ago.
So the interesting thing for that was so we did a workshop in 2017, and that was done with a 17-piece orchestra, 17-piece student orchestra. And the thing is, the pieces that, I mean, the score is basically the same that it was in 2017. The only thing that's been added is a little bit of incidental music to fit scenes that were maybe added for the recording purposes. So I've added stuff, but most of it stayed the same, because the thing I realized in the first workshop was that any sort of weakness was sort of down to the short amount of time we had to rehearse, and also just by going with, pro studio players, they're all going to be playing just like soloists. And so it's going to be a much more full sound, which was probably my only complaint about the workshop score. And it wasn't really adjusting much of the orchestration at that point. So it was nice to hear what came across in the workshop initially, which was very, very good already. And I just knew that having those pro players in Abbey Road would just make it that much better. So it was great. We only bumped up, or the only thing I did was add a couple more violins, actually. So we went from 17 players to 22 players. And I think that extra couple of violins really added depth, especially Kate. Kate was the one that made it worth it. So it added just a little bit more lushness. I mean, it's still not a huge string size, but it does give it a little bit more oomph.
When they're the top players in London, it gives
yeah,
it
exactly.
It?
Yeah, sizes and everything. Eh?
So, Michael, I had a wee question for you. When you did your first workshops in 2017, like, I don't know if you can remember, because I mean that's a while ago now, but before you did the workshops, when you had been writing it straight into Sibelius and everything, and then after you heard them, did you feel like that's what I thought was exactly what happened, or like was there some things that surprised you? Were there some things where like, oh, maybe I would change it?
I mean, as much irk as I got last week for having no performer. I actually don't listen that much to Sibelius playback, because to be quite honest, the way that I sort of wrote most of this was sort of laying on my back on the floor, just sort of staring up at the ceiling and just like closing my eyes and really trying to imagine it, and purely getting it down in notation form was just sort of orchestrating it out. I didn't really sort of listen to much of the playback. The only playback I adjusted on sort of Sibelius was to give to the singers to have something to reference before we did the workshop. So I wasn't really basing it off of that. I was imagining in my mind what it would sound back, or what it would sound like.
Match the result. That was more my question.
Yes, I think so.
Well, hats off.
I'm trying to think. I think maybe what surprised me a little bit was maybe not as much low end as I expected. And that's more just because the bass player I got didn't have a chance to read through it. He basically came and sight read it on the day. So that's part of the reason why it may have not been as confident, but especially adding that second cello. So having two cellos and a bass for the actual recording really added that sort of beefiness I wanted. I'd say that was probably the most surprising bit, was just, it didn't feel as full with just that one bass and cello. So it was definitely a good decision. And I also ended up actually changing the second horn part to trombone. And it was basically a transcription from horn to trombone, and then just adjusting the trombone at bits to sort of double up the cello or bass. That actually made a big difference as well, because then you get another color change as well. I mean, because you can really mask the trombone nicely underneath the horn when you need it to sound like a second horn. But when you need that beef to sound like a trombone, it's nice to have that as an option. So yeah, basically it just had to do with the balance between high and low. That was the only sort of surprising thing.
It's an interesting point. I mean, also because, for context, like Michael just happens to be an amazing bassoon player and has played in orchestras and sessions and, like has loads of experience in it. And as a double bass player, I found like that's really where I learned orchestration the best, is in rehearsal. And so I think it's interesting because I don't know if all of us are orchestral players or have kind of been, had the chance to regularly play in like a large ensemble like that. I mean, I know Vincenzo's a pianist, but you also play jazz. And so it's like you also get that kind of with a group. So kind of, I mean, what's that like for you guys? Because for me, that was when I was studying orchestration, but then I would go to rehearsal and we're breaking down the piece that we're playing into its parts as they're sort of rehearsing section by section, putting them together. It was like, living inside a score, and it was the best thing that you could do.
That's it. I mean, it's like watching a video game versus playing it. You learn how to play it by playing it. Yeah. And being in...
He says with his gamer headset.
It's not mine, just for those that might be judging me right now. Yeah, sorry, go on, Vic.
No, please. We were saying something. Feel free to finish.
I was just saying that, like, as Mike said, being you can't beat, perhaps maybe conducting at the front, but you can't beat being in it in a rehearsal, because then you see the questions people are asking, then you hear the sounds, you
hear stuff that you've never heard before.
Yeah, you're not just listening to a polished, perfect mixed recording of an orchestra playing. You are hearing mistakes, you're hearing the issues, you're hearing all of the, what's working and what isn't. And and being one of those people, I think is one of the best teachers, one of the best learning experiences rather you can have for orchestration. And in any ensemble, I think, as well. It's not just an orchestra, it's whatever you're playing in a big band as well, is great for that.
I think, surely playing in big band, ironically enough, playing in big band is something that I've really done only after I've stopped studying jazz. Like what I was studying in my conservatory, probably because we didn't have a proper big band. We did a lot of like projects with big ensembles, which was extremely useful for the same thing, like learning how to write and how to orchestrate for non-orchestral ensembles, which is something that we were saying earlier, and it's very fascinating, especially if you have like drum and bass and sort of more contemporary ensembles. It's really interesting. And then I've played in big band mainly while I was in college in London, studying film music. But what I wanted to say regarding like learning how to orchestrate being an orchestral player. So being a pianist, obviously, I've never really played much in a classical orchestra. But 21, 22-year-old me who was starting to deal with film music and orchestral music and that kind of stuff, and like, oh, okay, how do I write for that? And I wanted to learn that, and I bought the Adler, and I was completely freaked out and intimidated by that, so it stayed on the shelf for a couple more years before I actually got into that. And I thought, okay, I just gotta ask somebody. So I went to this teacher who was in my conservatory here in Italy, and he was like a conductor mainly. There was this student-led orchestra, and he was conducting that, and everyone was saying, oh yeah, he's just like the best, not only as a conductor but also as an orchestrator. Like, he can really teach you how to write for orchestra. So I went up to him and I was like, I'm interested in getting some private lessons, because I really would like to learn how to write for orchestra. And it was like, oh, okay, good, the first few lessons that I'm gonna give you are completely free. And I was like, well, amazing. And I was like, come every Thursday when we do rehearsals with the orchestra and just sit next to me. And I did that. Like, I went to a bunch of rehearsals and I was just like sitting there and looking at him conducting, listening to the orchestra playing, and having the score. And it's true, like, that's the best way to learn, because
that's the single best way.
You
exactly that.
You start realizing so many things of like, what are the dynamics at place, and what's what, and what. I think the most important thing is learning this thing sounds like that, this other thing sounds like that, and like hearing that and seeing it on a page, seeing it on the score, it's like better than any orchestration book or any.
Yeah, the Adler is gospel, but you can't learn in the same way as having the score in front of you whilst you're listening to it being played. And I think, I don't know about you guys, but listening, reading the scores of childhood favorites is a particularly good way of doing that, because they're just completely ingrained, and every nuance of the sound, and then suddenly you see it's like, oh, that's how he did that, and oh, that's how she did this, and it's just like that is just such a good way of learning it, I think.
Guys, can I take a moment to shoot down some questions? Because I've had one that I wanted to bring up for like 15 minutes, and I feel bad for the person who asked it a while ago. So there's 3 that I'm looking at. Let's just do them one at a time. So the first one is, how do you deal with the dreaded strings ensemble patch? Do you consolidate or compromise with the MIDI? How do you deal with too many string lines? Well, I'll just go first on that one. I don't think it should be dreaded. Personally, because I mean, you're gonna come in contact with it nonstop, so you should be ready for it. I mean, my starting point I always make is kind of, first of all, see if you can see continuity along the section. Let's say it's 16 bars or something. That, like, okay, is it 6 notes per chord the whole way through? Then decide how are you going to divide that among your strings, and then just do it that way. Look at it, see how the voice leading goes, and go from there. But if it's not consistent or whatever, just try and start from ranges. I just do like put the lowest parts at the bottom and work my way up and see what it looks like, and then just make alterations to it if you see that there's a problem with it. That's my first piece of advice. If anyone else wants to go.
Yeah,
I learned everything from you, Shane. So I yield my time.
Yeah, no, I think, and I guess, only to add to that, like, just understanding what, how many players you have from the beginning. So if like what you're splitting to the bottom is maybe 1 bass or 12 basses,
and kind of then, that could influence if it's one bass and 12 cellos versus 12 basses and 24 cellos, then, kind of how you split those might vary. But you could, I guess depending on the sound, if you want it homogeneous, then you're probably splitting them fairly evenly and giving maybe a few more numbers to the higher end, just because the lower end doesn't need as much. And yeah, which I think that also comes back to a principle that I was thinking of this earlier, that kind of like, if you look at the orchestra, it's pre-mixed, because it's kind of through like natural selection and evolution has become this group that it is over hundreds of years. So that's why the strings are up front, the percussion's in the back, because if it was any other way, then nothing would cut through. So it's kind of like, if you look at that and just think like, why is there typically 6 basses and then 16 first violins? It's because, it doesn't need as much, and depending on what they're playing and the way that they're split, kind of within those registers, it sort of comes through. So I think that also is just very logical. And you could then kind of apply that to a couple other, like applying those principles to electronic music and that sort of thing.
I think
getting off topic,
but I think just to sort of perhaps summarize both what you both said there, that you need to think vertically and horizontally. So vertically, you're dealing with balance. It's kind of implied what you said there about massive chordal patches, which are always a bugger if you've got to add other things as well. But in which case you're thinking about priority, and usually there's a melodic line that needs to stick out, and so the chordal takes second priority. But generally, vertically is all about balance. Horizontally, as Shane said, you're dealing with voice leading and that continuity of the line, and so you're looking for that that horizontal line going through in a part, and you imagine being the player and reading it. You don't want to
you can sing it or play it on the piano and see what does it feel like to be that person. And
if I may, quite often composers do not have time to consider voice leading in chordal patches, and I think as an orchestrator, part of your job is to suggest a better voice leading. If they've got a lovely, it's often played pianistically, which can suit a string patch, so, as the hand fits the piano, and then randomly there might be an added third or something low down, and you might be like, well, why have they done that? Do they actually mean to do that? And so part of your job is perhaps to flag that and suggest something else. But generally, I think it's those two principles, isn't it? It's the vertical and the horizontal. Yeah, great. Okay, that one we could probably talk for an hour just about that one question, but let's just go on because I see some other ones. The next one's just a quick one. Alessandro on YouTube. Are you typing on YouTube, Alessandro, or is it a different one? No, I'm sure it's a different one. It says, I saw Mike's videos on Twitch. I'm interested in his Cubase template. Can you make a video where you talk in detail about your templates? Thank you. I'm sure we will. We have a weekly video series where we individually each put up one video on a topic that interests us. So we'll definitely add templates into the list. Maybe Mike can take that one.
Yeah, I mean, and on my personal channel, absolutely. It's kind of my channel is also just for this sort of thing. I have a kind of loose structure of things that I, want to kind of offer and deliver, but that changes all the time. So, semi-shameless plug, but you can just check out, I created a Discord for my channel, which is essentially a way that it's easier so that people can reach out instead of through email or whatever. So feel free to join that, and you can essentially then text me and kind of suggest things like that. And it's a helpful community over there. So yeah, absolutely happy do like a template kind of breakdown and that kind of thing. I've talked about it in a couple videos and that sort of thing, but could do one dedicated just to that.
Great. And then the last one that was left floating was PokeLop98 asks, not sure how useful it is to split performer's perspective from composer's perspective, but being in sessions and rehearsals to understand both seems very important. Yeah, I agree with that. Then here's the question. How might one learn about the player's perspective on instruments and instrument families we're less familiar with to be able to write for them better? For example, strings.
Can I take that?
Yes, please.
I made a name for myself when I was in college for literally like stalking
I was about to say
my
this.
player friends and
No,
whatever.
that wasn't a joke. Sorry.
No. I could have gone another direction, but anyway, no, literally.
But Vincenzo, the other name.
No, but seriously, literally anything that I was writing, especially for recording sessions and for college projects that I knew were gonna be somehow played live or recorded live, I would ask any of my player friends to double check that with me. Like sit down, buy them a nice cup of coffee or have lunch together, and can you please look at this part and tell me if I wrote harmonics in a correct way? Can you explain that a bit more to me? Can you give me some feedback on, these slurs for winds? I don't know anything about breathing. I don't know the first thing about this and that. And the amount of information that a player can give you, first of all, they want to be heard, because ultimately the thing that you're writing is going to be played by them. So their job one day is going to be to play all the crap that we write. So it's in their interest to teach us how to become a better composer and orchestrator. And so anytime I've asked some friends to double check some stuff that I was writing, they've always been happy and enthusiastic, because they feel like they're happy to do that because they're gonna have to play that. So it's in their interest, and they're the best teachers that you can possibly get. Just ask them. They've been playing their instruments for their whole life, and I think you're writing a piece of music, so especially if it's orchestral, you're gonna end up writing a bit of everything for everybody, and then just reach out to people. And I've learned so much more by asking my fellow students about how, like, if what I wrote was playable, and to give me in general feedback and comments. I've learned so much more from this than from attending orchestration and composition lectures and classes.
I think to add to that, there's also a few kind of really good resources you can find online that are more specific. So like I wouldn't type into YouTube how to write for harp, but if you Google that, you could find, I forget, it might be like writingforharp.com or something like that. There's a harpist who has compiled all of these resources because harp is, arguably one of the most difficult instruments to write for, because unless you're a harpist, it's difficult to understand the mechanics of how to play it. So, there's so many helpphul resources out there, like, even with audio examples. I found, at one point I was writing a piece and wanted to use sort of like multiphonics in the clarinet and stuff like that. And there's a website that can show you, like, this is that multiphonic with 3 different fingerings. And this is the difference in sound that these 3 different fingerings, give you, and that kind of stuff. So I think you can find really specific resources like that from players that are providing that generously to the world. And, the more you can kind of come with that, then you can show up with an idea. But even, short of that, if you think, like, I remember in college, we had a couple sessions like with our friend Zach, who did like, let's get a bunch of composers together and do like a saxophone demo. And he just kind of, took an hour and played through all of this crazy stuff that a saxophone could do that was a bit atypical. And I remember taking so much away from that, and just even kind of how it could handle like microtones and things like that you wouldn't really expect were so much easier than on like a clarinet. So yeah, I think, those kinds of things too, like don't be afraid to reach out, be like, let's do a cool, informative demo session, especially during college. That's, it's what you're there for.
Yeah. And I just had a thought, which is that if you are lucky enough to have a player that you can speak to in college, or if you just know a player and you ask them about a section of music or an excerpt or whatever, it's really good, not only, as Vincenzo was saying, to have them explain to you why it works or doesn't, but have them just play it. Even if it doesn't work and you can hear why it doesn't work and you see why it doesn't work, that lesson will stick with you so much more quickly and will last for a long time in your mind, rather than just saying, oh, it won't sound nice if I play that. Well, okay, play it, and then you'll see exactly why, and you'll learn a lot from that are more than in the words that they can just tell you of, oh, it won't be good or whatever.
Music isn't always supposed to sound nice.
Well, you know what I mean.
Sometimes it's
Yeah.
no. I'm serious. I mean, that's part of it. Their reaction will be, well, that's not going to sound the best it can sound. It's like, well, maybe I've deliberately given it to you and not the clarinetist because I want it to sound like that.
Yeah.
But you need to know how it's going to sound.
I argue that I think kind of no matter what, you need a certain amount of hours in front of a group, in front of or individuals. Like you just need time listening to it more than anything, because it doesn't matter how many lectures or master classes or things like that you can listen to. As soon as if you can conduct a group for 10 minutes, you're going to learn so much more than, reading half a dozen textbooks.
Yeah. Sorry, go on, Mike.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, on that, I conducted an amateur group, and they'd be the first to admit they don't always play it right. And there's some, you learn a lot from it being played wrong as well. Like there's an immediacy of the mechanics going on there. It's like, even, I realize that usually you want to be writing for players that are at the top of their game, but you really start to understand how they're playing stuff when they're actually struggling to play it, and you can see the real mechanics of it. But
and again, not just an orchestra. Like if you wanted to understand what a harmonica does, compared with other instruments, or figure out how that could kind of sit in, or even guitar. Like guitar was my first instrument. I wouldn't say I even really understand just the basics of what a true guitarist could do with the instrument, then adding effects pedals and all this stuff, and like, why are different guitarists have their individual signature sound? It's so vast. And so you can just kind of, the more you talk to people and listen, the more you're going to learn.
Yeah. I had another question, if that's all right, guys.
Go ahead.
It's not past your bedtime yet.
It's getting close.
So I wondered about. Well, actually, it's kind of a couple of questions, really. One sort of more towards Ale, perhaps. I mean, from my point of view, and I suspect a couple of us here, we are clearly, we're talking about thinking orchestrally, or certainly with orchestral instruments, as being how we think when we're writing, and we'll obviously have to double that with more synthy sounds or other things. And I wonder if there's anyone amongst us that thinks in the reverse and is thinking in terms of just sound, and then when they have the electronic version of that, do you then want to double it with something that's acoustic, or thinking of it that way around? And I might as well get my other question out while I'm here. I another side to that is a friend of mine and ours, a contemporary of ours at college, Samuel Anani, who I work with a lot. He is basically an electronic composer, but he likes it to be a very collaborative process with the orchestrator, which is me, and he will send me his electronic demo and say, write this for orchestra. And then we'll record it. Now, I wanted to ask if anyone, plans to kind of work in that way, as to have this very much, a more even keel of creative input into the final product with an orchestrator, rather than it be, there you go, there's my music, just make the orchestral parts.
Well, I've been doing that for the last year or so, since I've discovered the modular synths, mostly because it's not like maybe the fact that I know the orchestra and I know in my head how everything more or less sounds. Once you sit in front of that, you're basically discovering it. So sometimes it happens that you sit down with the intention of write something electronic, and then you find something that at one point you think, wow, maybe a piano would go perfectly with this, or strings, or I don't know, a bassoon or whatever, because it would go perfect with something that you didn't necessarily sit down to do in the first place. So yeah, that happens to me, to go the other way around.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Well, I think with I mean, my intention with my album was to kind of try to push myself out of that a little bit. In where I sort of like my initial concept was to write half the pieces starting from electronic music, and kind of like explore and write a structure as a piece of electronic music on its own first, and then kind of apply that to orchestra. So a lot of what I was thinking in that is sort of like, here's a texture that I made, with acoustic instruments. How can I then recreate that with electronics? What does that texture, how could it be achieved? But also like, what could be accomplished more with, this other sort of tool, or other textures, and then vice versa. So kind of like creating something that can really sort of, I think of a lot of electronics like, it can change timbre unlike acoustic instruments can. It can sort of slide through colors in a completely different way. And so then thinking of like, how do I then apply that to an orchestra that's maybe more like fixed in terms of timbre? And so if I'm thinking of that with one section, which is sort of more homogeneous, versus like now blending sections, and then it's kind of exploring like the traditional kind of orchestrational training, of like, oh, I can blend these colors, but then what if you're like, I think of it sometimes that way, like the orchestra's been around for hundreds of years, and then in like the late 60s, we got another orchestra. Like we got all of a sudden all of this limitless sound and possibilities that sort of evolved and developed, and are still learning how to use those. And those are still, like we're creating new instruments for out of electronics every day. So I think that's really exciting. And then kind of thinking like, how can those principles of like, what are the strengths of each of those, and then how can you kind of like try to emulate them with each other, I think is a really interesting sort of blur, or a cool place to play with texture.
Yeah, it's got, I mean, I love the orchestration process with working with Sammy, because it's and yeah, I weirdly never really think. Yeah, I mean, and no credit to me for this. I mean, I never really think that way. I usually think, could this do with some synth? Or I could add that, and what should I add? It's rarely, starting off with something electronic and then. Well, I love the process of adapting or arranging something that is using electronic sounds for orchestra. I think it's great. It's like kind of, you're like weathering it. It's really cool. Or like being Geppetto turning Pinocchio into a real boy or something. It's a really weird process, but I love doing it.
I wonder if you guys, maybe think of it in this way too, a bit like something that made a lot of sense with that approach to me is, I remember when we were working on Infinite Bridge, and there was part of the sort of visual team for that, this guy Hannah that Aurelian brought in, who like, he would do this with photography. He would sort of like maybe take, an analog photo, and then he would like process it digitally, and then he would take that digital print and kind of like recreate it out of analog and make a sort of like film print, and then go back and process that digitally again. And it was like going back and forth between these mediums. And I found that such a like, creative concept. And you can kind of break those apart of like, they're all just tools. It's all just tools and color and, a kind of playground. So it's an interesting way to think of like, how you can then take your synths and then like shoot them out, in an acoustic space, play them out through speakers, and kind of like capture an acoustic sound with that too, from like a production point of view.
Yeah, we did that at Air with some synths. We set all the microphones up to record synths through Air overnight.
Just a big guitar amp shootout.
what was that back for Mission Impossible?
Yeah.
I think that's I remember like I was in college back then, and we came to listen to the session, and I was astonished by that, by the idea of like having synths being played into the room to then mic the room and capture that sound.
I did that for my EP actually, but with acoustic elements. So the idea was to have layers of different distances, so you could play around with that in the mix. So we went to me and Sammy actually went to this church at 4 a.m. in Battersea and had these really nice kind of old speakers, and we just set up some microphones at the front, like on the altar, and had the speakers at the back of the church, the middle, and the front, and it's a completely different thing. It's so spooky.
Such a cool technique.
And Sam, I mean, initially
you would do it with guitar amps. So why not with,
yeah, but you can imagine, like, in this very kind of ghostly, like, church, there's something about capturing that that brings something different to it, as well as the airplanes flying over at 6 a.m, which I maintain I've kept deliberately on the EP.
That's so cool, guys. That's really a technique that like really impressed me, because I had like never thought of and never.
It's really interesting.
Really, a lot of these are, not, new or invented by us in any way. I mean, a lot of like old sort of rock and pop records, pioneered this stuff. Like
Deep Purple were doing that with the Hammond.
Yeah.
40 years ago. So that's cool.
Yeah, but we thought of it first.
None of us claim to have thought of it first. For the
record. Shane with a disclaimer. Cool. Guys, that feels like a good place to kind of wrap things up for tonight.
What's the only shame, Mike?
I think we will have to revisit this topic, because there's, again, a lot more to say, but we can always...
Yeah.
Sorry, Vincenzo, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I'm really sad because I didn't get to mention Jacob Collier tonight.
Well, you did now.
But I just did.
Go listen to Michael's musical on Friday.
Yeah.
It's
for
fucking
Michael.
amazing. And it's recorded in the best possible way in one of the best possible rooms in the world.
Michael, the best possible players.
Yeah, Michael, can we say that we were lucky enough to get a little preview? A little pre-release preview, and I haven't had a chance to comment on the chat that we have, so I'm gonna do it now live in front of 4 million viewers. No, seriously. The other day when you
divided by 4 million.
Yeah, exactly. No, but seriously, the other day when you sent that to us, I then eventually got to listen to it, and I was just like, man, I was like. Literally, like I was almost getting to tears. Like it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful.
That's
massive.
Very kind of you to say, especially very meaningful to me, because you know what it's like to be under Venetian skies, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's it. I feel like there's something like there's some self sort of, I don't know. I knowing that it's set, like the setting is in Venice, and like it's just so beautiful. It's special.
Well,
so,
congratulations.
Thank you.
You'll enjoy this, Vincenzo. Someone in our chat Pokélop just said, I have a lecture with Jacob at Guildhall tomorrow. Very excited.
No! This person.
Maybe
Vincenzo wasn't in Italy.
Oh yeah, you're in Italy right now.
No, he's giving.
I'm gonna go.
Can you please record it illegally and then send it to me? No, who's this person?
I'm not sure. Just a user in
Is
our
it on
chat.
Twitch?
Yeah, on Twitch chat.
A student at Guildhall, presumably.
Must be.
Please come back next week and let us know what you thought, because I'm a huge Jacob Collier fan, and I'd be really interested in knowing.
Gotta ask him about the percentage of swing. See if it's still 7%.
Yeah, maybe there's been
Ale,
some
go
updates.
to Guildhall. Ale, go to Guildhall and ask him that. Like, he may actually give you some.
I'm afraid of COVID.
Jacob covered.
Oh.
Okay.
COVID.
Cool. So
Guys, that was great fun.
Yeah.
I guess we'll
Yeah,
see
thanks,
each other
guys.
next week for another chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take care.
Have a
Stay
good
safe.
night.
All right.
Wear sunscreen.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.